be glad in it, and be glad in it. For this is the day that the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. This is the day, this is the day that the Lord has made.
You also know an Israeli one, Hodul Adonai Kitov.
Yes.
Hodul Adonai Kitov. Hine olam hazeh. Hodul Adonai Kitov. Hine olam hazeh. Hodul Adonai Kitov. Hodul Adonai Kitov.
People coming to speak with us. I think that there'll be a local choir coming to sing. So that will be the first meeting this morning. At the end of that meeting, there'll be an opportunity to plant tulips. It's not going to be straight in the ground. I believe it's going to be into pots that will later be put into the ground. And then after we leave from Habsor, we're going to Be'eri, where David Parsons will be meeting us. And then he'll be giving us an overview over Gaza and also showing where the ICEJ planted the forest near Be'eri. And then from there we're going to drive past where the burnt cars are being kept as a kind of a memorial to what took place on October the 7th. Probably we won't be able to go right into that area because it's Erev Sukkot. It's like a Shabbat, and so it will be closed much earlier than normal, but God willing we'll be able to see from the outside. And then from there we're going to go to the Nova Festival site at Re'im, where some of the worst atrocities took place on October the 7th, and you'll get to see the memorial that has also been created there in the park of Re'im. And then from there we're going to travel to Kfar HaNokdim, and at Kfar HaNokdim you'll receive Bedouin hospitality, you'll have a wonderful meal, and then the evening service will be at Kfar HaNokdim, and then we'll travel back at the end of the day to Jerusalem. So that's plus or minus how the day will go today. The manifest presence of God will return to Jerusalem, and that God will come and rule and reign again, that he will set up the place of his throne in Jerusalem. And it's been very, very moving to see tens of thousands of people in Jerusalem really crying out to the Lord for deliverance and for salvation during this season. So I think it's fascinating that actually the period of Sukkot comes right after this period of the 10 days of awe. It's like God prescribed this period of introspection and searching one's heart. Create in me a clean heart, O God, right? And renew a right spirit within me, as David cried out to the Lord in Psalm 51. And I think it's really fascinating that that comes right before the period of greatest joy and of greatest rejoicing. There was a saying that he who has not seen Jerusalem during Sukkot doesn't understand what rejoicing is, but it's like you have to have the depth of the introspection and the searching and the confession of sin that we just went through on Yom Kippur, where the whole nation for 25 hours is literally confessing every possible sin before the Lord. And for anybody that has not read the Jewish Siddur, the order of service for Yom Kippur, it's such a poignant thing where the people are confessing sins of things that they've done, things that they haven't done, things that we've said, things that we have not said, and it's really like a holy hush descends on the land like no other day of the year. It's so special. The other day we were singing the song, the Paul Wilbur song, I Enter the Holy of Holies. I think it was just before Yom Kippur, and it was as if the presence of God came so strong in the room that nobody wanted to move. And it really reminded me of the moment when the high priest enters into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. And of course, he's entering with fear and trembling, right? Because he doesn't actually know if he's going to come out alive or dead. And for that reason, he had a piece of rope tied around his ankle. And he also had 72 bells and pomegranates on the bottom part of his garment, so that the other priests who were ministering in the temple would be able to hear if the ringing stopped. And they knew that if the ringing stopped, it was not good news for the high priest, right? It meant that the sacrifice had not been received that year, and the high priest had actually died. And I think that really speaks to us of the fear of the Lord. And the Word of God says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, right? The beginning, just the beginning. Sometimes we forget this part, I think. We forget that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And there's another very powerful testimony about the high priest entering the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, and it's actually written in a Jewish source that has no interest in recording this, which makes me think that it probably is true. It's recorded in the Talmud, and it says that there used to be a piece of fabric in the temple that was scarlet color. And when the high priest entered the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, if the sacrifice was received by God, it would turn from scarlet to white. Just like the psalmist says, you will turn my sins from crimson to, you will make me white as snow, right? So this piece of fabric would literally turn from scarlet to white. But it's recorded in the Talmud that after the time that Yeshua died on the cross, it never turned color again. Because Yeshua was the perfect sacrifice. The sacrifices were no longer needed in the temple, and so it no longer turned from scarlet to white. It's because on that morning I had laid the table in our sukkah, and I had invited some guests, and one of them was driving to my home from northern Samaria, and she was driving on Highway 1, and she got to Latron and she saw the tank. And then by the time that she arrived, we began to understand that something is very badly wrong. And of course it took quite a number of hours before we understood just how badly wrong everything was. But the area where that tank was positioned at Latron is very significant, actually, because that was a primary area of battle both in 1948 and in 1967. It was a very, very strategic location. And in fact, where we turn to the left, technically, that's actually on the, in inverted commas, wrong side of the green line. So what does that actually mean in practical terms? So, to the history of the Gaza envelope as well. So, during the Ottoman period, we have an area that is being ruled by an empire. And in a sense, we don't have countries in that region, in this region at that time at all. So I'm talking about until 1917. And there is one country that exists at that moment and has existed for thousands of years, almost with no break, and that's Egypt, right? Egypt has existed as a separate entity. But the rest of the region really was divided up into what the Ottomans called sanjaks, which were like administrative districts. So you had the Sanjak of Jerusalem, and actually at that time the Gaza envelope fell under the Sanjak of Jerusalem. It was under the administrative district of Jerusalem. So if we fast forward to 1917, that's really a miraculous moment in the modern history of the state of Israel. It's really the beginning of it, because in that year, of course, two very, very significant things happen. One is the Balfour Declaration, which was not a legally binding document. It was, however, a statement of intent. And that statement of intent was to say that the Jewish people have a right to a national homeland in their ancient land, right? Now, in that very same year, by the providence of God, the Ottoman Empire are able, the British Empire are able to conquer the land from the Ottoman Empire. And actually the south of the country is very instrumental in this whole story, because it begins in the south. It begins in the area of Egypt, it continues in Gaza, it continues in Beersheba, and then continues up to the north, where eventually the battle is won in the area of Megiddo. A very significant battle is won in the area of Megiddo. Now, at that time, what happens is that 3 years later, there's going to be a conference, and that conference is called the San Remo Conference. And what happens at that conference actually is legally binding until today. At that moment, the British are given the mandate over this region. And does anybody know how they decide the line on the map? How they decide what the shape of Israel is going to be? Or, as they were called at that time, British Mandate Palestine. Do you guys know how they made that decision? No? Okay, praise God, I know something you don't. They open their Bible and they start looking at the maps in the Bible. And do you know which map they actually look at? They look at the map from the time of David and Solomon. Do you guys remember what the borders of the land were that were given early on in the book of Genesis, the first time that God promises the land to Abraham and his descendants? What are the borders?
From the river to the sea.
Not from the river to the sea. From the river to the other river, right? From the river to the river. Which river and which river? Yeah, the Brook of Egypt, and that's actually argued about. Some people will say it's the Nile, and some people will say it's a river which is further north from the Nile. I think most mainstream opinion would actually go with the Nile. And the one in the north is not disputable. It's talking about the Euphrates. Either way, it's a huge swathe of land, right? Absolutely enormous, much bigger than we have today. Have those borders ever been fulfilled historically? Yes, when? Yes, exactly. During the time of the reign of David and Solomon. And how did they accomplish it? What was one of the ways these guys accomplished it? War, yes. Something else? Lots of wives, right? Strategic marriages. It was absolutely a part of their political expansion, was strategic marriages. If you think about Solomon, who marries Pharaoh's daughter, right? How do you have dominion all the way down to possibly the Nile? You have strategic alliances. What about King Hiram of Tyre, who sends all the materials for the building of the temple, right? You have to have relationship. And what better way than to marry all of these daughters? Solomon had quite a lot of wives, right? Yes, and concubines and all the rest of it. So yeah, war was a part, and strategic alliances and relationships was another part. And there was another very significant part to how they were able to conquer such a large portion of the region. If you study biblical history carefully, you will notice something about when the borders of the land expand and when they contract. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? When the borders of the land expand, it is always at a time that there is a godly king who is in right relationship with God, and it is always at a time when the people are in unity. Those are the two keys. When the people are not in right relationship with God, and when they are not in unity with each other, what happens? The borders of the land shrink. And if it gets even worse and they fall into idolatry, what happens next? God kicks us out of the land, right? God kicks us out of the land. It becomes very serious. So yeah, the borders were fulfilled at the time of David and Solomon. Some people also would argue that the borders were fulfilled at the time of the Hasmoneans. They also had quite big borders to the land at that time. So that was how the mandate was decided. And are you guys familiar with the map of British Mandate Palestine? What it included? Yeah, exactly. It included the entirety of what later became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Jordan didn't yet exist, but it included all of it. What else did it include? Anybody knows?
Syria.
The West Bank, yeah. Anything else? The Golan Heights. The Golan Heights, right? That was all included. Now, does anybody know about the legal implications of a mandate? So the legal implication of a mandate is that after the country that was given the mandate leaves the region, those are the legally defined borders of the land. And this is super important, because if you want to talk about Israel with somebody that doesn't yet know God, you can even defend her without using scripture at all. Not that I'm advocating that you do that, but if you are in a position where you need to, you can actually do it, because what was ratified in the San Remo conference is legally binding until today. That means the official legal borders of the state of Israel until today include the Golan Heights, Judea and Samaria, or what is referred to as the West Bank, and the entirety of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And that's quite shocking, right? If you're not familiar with this subject, there is a fantastic documentary series about it that was made by Hugh Kitson. He did 10-minute YouTube clips that you can access for free, and it's done by international human rights lawyers who really understand this subject inside out, and it's really a fascinating listen. So those were the borders of the land given by the League of Nations at that time to the British as a mandate over the land. They were supposed to be the parents in charge. It was not a colonial acquisition. They were supposed to rule over the land until such a time as we, the Jewish people and the Arabic-speaking people, in inverted commas, grew up enough to be able to rule our own country. That was basically the idea. So what was it called? It was called British Mandate Palestine, right? Now, this is very, very interesting, and it should mess with the heads of people that associate the word Palestine in a very different way today. Because who was British Mandate Palestine supposed to be the national home for? The Jewish people. Have any of you ever looked at the Larousse dictionary from 1939 and opened the page of maps? Have you ever done that? If not, you can look online and you can see it. But on the left-hand side of the page, one of the flags is the flag of Nazi Germany. On the right-hand side of the page is the flag of British Mandate Palestine. Does anybody know what it looks like? It's exactly the same as today. It's the Star of David with the two stripes of the talit, but the colors are very slightly different. It's yellow, blue and white instead of just blue and white, which is interesting considering the yellow that we see everywhere today, right? So the flag of British Mandate Palestine was the Star of David. I think this is very important. At that time also, you had the Palestine Philharmonic Orchestra in Tel Aviv. Who was that orchestra solely comprised of? Yeah, the Jewish people mostly who had come back from Europe. Highly skilled musicians, right? If you look in Judea, and in the northern part, it becomes called Samaria or Shomron after the capital, which was Samaria. Okay, so that's why Yeshua refers to that part of the country as Judea and Samaria. But before that, all of it was simply referred to as Israel. And actually, it's very interesting. I don't know if you guys are familiar with what happened in Nashville, Tennessee at the National Broadcasters Conference. After October the 7th, there were quite a number of us who felt led to go as close as we could get to the Reim site and actually ask God for forgiveness, because for quite a number of years before it happened, and I'll maybe share a little bit about this at Masada too, but I really felt like every time I took groups at Masada and I spoke about what happened in AD 70, I really felt convicted to share with the people, like, the state of my nation today is no different than it was in AD 70. And if that's the case, and if God is the same today as he was 2,000 years ago, we're in really big trouble. And just as the Romans breached the wall before Jerusalem was taken, our wall here was breached. They now know in 119 places, I think. Our wall was breached, but the real breach happened before that. The real breach happened in the heart of the nation. The real breach happened because we turned from God, and because we became prideful, and because we were fighting with one another, and we still are fighting with one another. And it was quite astonishing to me, actually, because there were many different groups of believers that went and performed acts of repentance in different places in the land and asked God for forgiveness, because after October the 7th, we understood no matter what the human dynamics were in that moment, and there were a lot of human dynamics, and you can go completely crazy thinking about them. How did it happen? Where was the army? Where were the You can go on and on and on and on for days and days thinking about how on earth this happened. Lower that. But above all of that is God. And October the 7th could not have happened if God didn't lift his hand for a moment. And for those of us that lived in the land, we understood we need to know why he lifted his hand, and we need him to put back his hand, because if he doesn't, we're gone. I remember there was one day shortly after, I think it was October the 10th or the 11th, and it literally looked like the whole of the north of the country was gone. Like, it was covered with red alerts in a way that unfortunately we've seen quite a number of times since. But up until that point, we hadn't seen it at all. And I remember I had two maps on the floor, and I don't even know why I had them on the floor. I had one of the north and one of the south, and when I saw that, I just fell on the map and I just started crying out to the Lord. And one of my primary prayers during that whole season was, in judgment remember mercy, in judgment remember mercy, in judgment remember mercy. And a little bit after that, there was an article that appeared in an online document called Israel 365, and it was fascinating. It was written by the son of Benjamin Netanyahu, Yair Netanyahu, who was a colorful character to say the least. But this article was very profound, and it was actually called The Seven Sins That Led to October the 7th. And after that, there were even meetings in the Knesset where the people were actually crying out for mercy from God. And it was as if for a moment the nation remembered and acknowledged our deep need of God. And it was almost like the shock to the system that showed us we've placed our faith in our army, we've placed our faith in our government, we've placed our faith in our leaders, we've forgotten to place our faith in him, and now we really understand that we need him. desperately. And I think in general, this whole season, in the desperation, in the trauma, the people have been really crying out to God, and there has been a greater openness for him now, I think, than ever before, both in religious circles and in people who are hungry to hear about Messiah as well. The openness is quite amazing. There are quite a number of Jewish ministries that have been doing a lot of outreach during this season, and even just on a very practical level, feeding soldiers like Pastor Israel Liluz in Kiryat Shmona. I think he's shared a number of times on the GPG as well. So in that way, it's really been a beautiful season, because it's actually showed us the true condition of our hearts and our great need for him. Let's go back for a moment to the term Palestinian. So at this moment that this line is drawn, I want you to imagine that this bus is a house, and I want you to imagine that let's say Eliezer and I, we're brother and sister, and we're Arabic speaking and we're Muslim, okay? And I want you to imagine that now the line is going to be drawn down the middle of the bus, and Eliezer is now on the left of the green line, I'm now on the right of the green line. From one day to the next, now Eliezer is called a Palestinian and I'm called an Israeli Arab. That's how ridiculous the term Palestinian is. Okay, it doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't tell us anything about ethnicity, and it doesn't tell us anything about religion at all. Today, it is purely used as a political term to deny the right of the Jewish people to live in the land. Quite honestly, we should erase the term Palestinian completely, and we should also erase the term West Bank completely. They are purely political terms to erase the right of the Jewish people to live in the land. That's all they are. So then we have to ask ourselves another question: who are all these peoples that we have stuck this label on of Palestinian? So we're talking about people that live in Judea and Samaria who are not Jewish, and we're talking about people who live in the area of the Gaza Strip. Who are they? Well, some of them are Lebanese, descended from the ancient Phoenicians. Some of them are Maronites, that's a branch within Christianity, who fled from Lebanon during the Second Lebanon War. Maybe they served with the Lebanese army, maybe they were Christian phalangists who stood against people like Hezbollah and so on, the terror groups, and so they fled to the Israeli side of the border, and they ended up living in Judea and Samaria. Some of them are Bedouin, like in the Negev. We have a very large number of Bedouin who live in the Negev desert. The Bedouins, by the way, are ethnically Arab. We'll get to the term Arab in just a minute. Who else do we have living in Judea and Samaria? We have some people that came over from what had become the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in 1946. They are also ethnically Arab. The Jordanians, the Saudi Arabians, they're ethnically Arab. Another fascinating part of the people groups who live in Judea and Samaria, for example, in the Jerusalem area, there are quite a number of Christian villages, and some of the people from those villages used to work at Saraltos, and one day my husband was having a conversation with them, and they were telling him that they were aware that actually their family background was that they were Jewish. The world would call them Palestinian Arab Christians, but the truth was they're actually Messianic Jews. One time I was in Bethlehem, and I was being guided by a friend of mine, and she always tells the people on the bus, we're part of one of the oldest Jewish families in Bethlehem. She is a part of the Catholic Church that is right on Manger Square. So again, for the world, she's a Palestinian Arab Christian. The truth of the matter is, she's a Jewish follower of Yeshua. She's a Messianic Jew. One time I went into a shop in Bethlehem and I was speaking to the shopkeeper, and I looked at him and I said, "What proportion of the believers in Bethlehem are ethnically Jewish?" He looked at me like I was completely stupid and he said, "All of them." And I was in shock. So many of the Christians in the land are actually ethnically Jewish, and even within the Muslim communities within Judea and Samaria, many of them close their windows very tightly, or the curtains, on Friday night. Do you know what they do? Light Shabbat candles. They light Shabbat candles. How did this happen? Imagine when the armies come through, each of the empires that have come through historically in the last 2,000 years. Generally, when those armies came, the people who lived there already had three choices. First choice, leave. Second choice, die. Third choice, convert. If you think about it biblically, every time there is an exile, what is there also? There's a remnant left in the land. So for example, when the northern kingdom is exiled first, what does Hezekiah have to do in Jerusalem? He has to expand the wall to the north and to the west in order to take in the refugees from the north, right? So sometimes we talk about the missing tribes. The truth is they were never actually lost, because there were representation from every tribe that went into exile in Babylon, because they had already been brought into within the walls by Hezekiah. So they were already in Jerusalem. All the tribes were already mixed up at the time of the second exile. So they were never completely lost. So imagine the people loved the land so much that in order to stay there, they were willing to convert. So if the Christians came, they converted. If the Muslims came, they converted. But some of them are probably descendants of the original Jewish people who had settled in that region. Who else could there be in that region? Well, when we're first exiled, what happens? We bring in a whole bunch of people from Assyria. Do you remember the story? What happens after that? Some of them get eaten by lions, right? And then they ask, who's the god of this region? We're obviously worshipping the wrong god. We need to worship the god of this region. They later become the Samaritans, because they ask to take part in the rebuilding of the temple at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And the people say to them, no, you can't partake in the rebuilding of the temple because you weren't with us in exile. What do they do then? They then build an alternative site of worship in the northern part of Samaria, right? And then they become called the Samaritans. The Samaritans are still in northern Samaria until today. There's about 400 of them left on the face of the earth. So it's a really big mixture of ethnicity. Another people group is Egyptians, and especially in the Gaza area, right? It's super close to the border with Egypt. It was less close during the season that Israel was in charge of the Sinai desert. But even within Judea and Samaria, there are many Egyptian families, and they can be identified by their last name. For example, the family Al-Masri, that's an Egyptian last name. So it's much more complicated than we think. It's been painted in these black and white colors, but that's not actually the truth. It's close to where everyone is waiting now. Not far from Chra. And so Ziklag is where David fights the battle with the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 30.
First of all, welcome. I've heard you've been singing away.
Yeah.
Hello, Jenny. Hello. So we're just going to park here, and then everyone's going to get off here. All right. For those who have registered, you can go straight.